everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session, which is 2A. We have a talk, A Neurodiversity Paradigm for Moral Responsibility, presented by August Gorman from Princeton University. And just to tell you a little bit something about August, he is a trans-disabled analytic philosopher of ethics and disability. They are values and public policy postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University, co-appointed in the Center for Human Values and the Center for Health and Wellbeing. Their work focuses on how traditional debates about agency, moral responsibility, well-being, and consent intersect with neurodivergent experiences and the lived realities of psychological disability. August?
Great. Thank you so much, Cecilia. And I just want to thank Shelley for inviting me to speak as part of this really incredible lineup. My talk today, it's going to flow, I think, quite nicely from our previous talk. I'm going to preview sort of the big idea from a book manuscript that I'm working on that uses a neurodiversity lens to articulate a new theory of moral responsibility. So,
August, if you don't mind me stepping in 1 second, I forgot to mention that there's closed captioning at the bottom of the screen if you go to the CC button. And then also, if you have questions during the Q&A session, please type in your question in the Q&A using the Q&A button. And then I'll go ahead and read that to August and he will respond.
Great. Oops. Thank you so much. Okay. So my plan for this talk is to do 3 things. First, I'm going to introduce 2 ways to think about agents with psychological differences that impact their agential functioning. So one that treats this kind of difference as defective and one that treats it as natural variance. Second, I'm going to show how the differences defect paradigm, or I think I might say the pathology paradigm, is implicit in the very foundations of the philosophy literature on moral responsibility. And third, I'm going to attempt just sort of the beginnings of a sketch of a model of how the moral responsibility literature might change on a neurodiversity paradigm and what the benefits of doing that might be. So I will be glossing over some of the finer details because my goal will be to give you a sense of the bigger picture idea, but I'm happy to delve sort of deeper into the specifics in the Q&A. So in order to talk about 2 different models for thinking about different kinds of agential differences, I want to start by talking about a different kind of difference and then working by analogy. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do something that might seem a little bit strange. Hold on. Okay, I want you to close your eyes and try to picture a red star. So close your eyes, try to picture a red star. Got it? Okay, so what did you see when you closed your eyes in your mind's eye? Did you see a perfectly clear red star like number 6, or did you see something fainter? Or perhaps if you're like me, you saw something closer to number 1. You saw absolutely nothing at all. So I use this example because much of common sense wisdom and philosophy seem to concur that being able to visually imagine things that are not present is a crucial and ubiquitous human capacity. The social world we live in is set up as though this is the case. We advise people with insomnia to count sheep. People who've lost their wallets to retrace their steps, assuming they'll be using their mind's eye to witness the sheep jumping over the fence, and to retrace the steps of their day. Philosophers have also built many theories that take as foundational Aristotle's premise that, quote, it is impossible to think without an image. Anyone who claimed to not have this ability, you might think, would have some sort of very strange brain defect indeed. But it turns out, actually, this is just not true and hasn't been fully realized until recently. Visualizing abilities naturally range across the spectrum from complete mind blindness to movie-like accuracy. So some people, they tell me when they close their eyes, they can watch almost like a video of something happening. I have no idea what that would be like. I close my eyes, there is nothing visual there whatsoever. So what is my point here? Well, there are 2 different ways that we can think about this sort of difference. We might take a difference as defect model, right? where there's some capacity that we take to be pretty fundamental to being human. And then we think, well, sadly, there are just some people who have something wrong with them and they're outside of that. Or we might adopt a neurodiversity model, according to which there just happens to be some natural human variance in terms of visualizing ability. And this is just sort of a neutrally balanced fact. And note that people who don't have strong visualizing abilities do use other strategies to do the same tasks. So they're starting to do some research. And they tested mental rotation tasks where, you're given like some sort of test and you see a 3D shape represented and you have to choose which one represents it turned around. They actually found that people who can't visualize do these tasks just as well. They just use other sorts of mental resources to do them, and it takes them a bit longer to do it. But they do it with the same amount of accuracy. So what I want you to note here is that there are sort of some pretty clear differences in the ethical landscape that's implied by these two different pictures. So the differences defect model, it sort of encourages an attitude of pity because it puts the onus on the person who falls outside of the norm to sort of advocate for themselves as well. And these are often people from a stigmatized group. But it sort of assumes that the rest of us, and generally speaking, are the normal people. And these are the important capacities. Now, the neurodiversity model, on the other hand, first of all, it eschews sharp divides between the normal agents and the others. It holds that we as people in general tend to be different in degree and not in kind. In this way, it doesn't exoticize differences. We can ask if our society is set up to cater better to people on some part of this spectrum, and how this might disable certain people. But our working assumption should be that people also have other ways of navigating the world if those ways are made available to them. So to see just sort of a clear ethical implication here, imagine you have a budget to spend on mental wellness programs in a workplace. Well, it seems clear that if we have the option, we should try to use the neurodiversity model and realize, since not everyone excels at visualizing, we shouldn't spend the entire budget on a guided visualization meditation program, right? Because there's some people who this is just going to do nothing for. And that seems pretty clearly right to me. A neurodiversity model also is going to encourage us to check our assumptions before we make judgments about people and before we blame them for something. So for example, if we take the neurodiversity model, you should not be so quick to accuse someone who, say, can't picture their wife's face. You shouldn't think, that person clearly doesn't care enough about their wife. Once you realize that people just vary along a spectrum for this sort of capacity. Okay. So I think it seems like kind of an easy sell to say we should aim to operate on a neurodiversity model as much as we can when it comes to these sorts of ethical questions that have to do with variance in visualizing ability. My real claim, though, is that we should do the same for variance in agential functioning. So some examples of what I mean by that: attention, memory, executive function, emotional mind reading ability, the impacts of trauma, these sorts of things. I think we should take a similar tack with these. But I think the need for a shift in this domain is especially hard to see in the current moral responsibility literature, because competence at these capacities is thought to be fundamental to what even makes us responsible agents. And this is sort of the way that literature is set up. So I think the difference is defect paradigm, or what we might call the pathology paradigm, is really implicit in many aspects of the moral responsibility literature. But today I'm just going to focus on one fundamental issue to illustrate the larger point. So I want to focus on the question of which actions are people in principle appraisable for. Okay. This is, I think, a very fundamental issue in moral responsibility, and being able to illustrate how the pathology paradigm sort of functions here should show us just sort of how deeply seated this paradigm is in this literature. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what the current dialectic looks like here. So take the following case. Suppose that there's a person who has Tourette syndrome and they have a particular kind of ticking behavior, coprolalia, which is the urge to sort of frequently utter obscenity. I'm a little hesitant to use this example because only about 10% of people who have Tourette syndrome have these particular kinds of tics, but I think that they have a clear sort of ethical implication. So I am going to use these cases, but I do want to note that. Because I think it's sort of stereotyped that that's the most common kind or something, but it's actually not. Okay, so here's my case though. A person who has this sort of ticking behavior has the urge to utter, let's say, a slur that targets a minority person who is in the room but is going to be leaving shortly. So let's suppose that this person does their tic and says the slur before the person leaves the room. Now, the way philosophers of moral responsibility might handle this case is to say, I think, one of two things. They might say, okay, well, this person clearly doesn't have any control over their actions. They're acting completely involuntarily. It's sort of like a twitch. So we shouldn't blame them. They're just out of control. Blame is not an appropriate reaction. We should instead pity this person. It's just unfortunate. But as it turns out, when you look at the actual lived experience of people with Tourette syndrome, many people, not all, but report their tics as being sort of voluntary responses to a buildup of internal pressure. And as being, they report that they're able to actually withhold their ticking for short periods of time. Although it's kind of quite psychologically painful to do so. So now returning to just the current dialectic, if that's right, sort of the only option is to say, okay, I guess these people are sort of autonomous after all. They are in control. If they could have held off, but they didn't, then I guess they're fully blameworthy for saying a horrible thing, just like anyone else who says a slur would be. But that doesn't seem right either. I think neither of these ways of handling the case are right. And notice we only really have these two options according to this dialectic. Either the person is defective as an agent, rendered completely non-autonomous by their medical condition, lacking control over what they do, or the person is failing at their personal responsibility, they're sort of making excuses. So what I want to do is sketch a different way entirely of looking at the case, and one that shifts to a neurodiversity paradigm. Okay, so I want to draw out sort of one way that we might use a neurodiversity paradigm to handle the case. I don't want to claim it's the only way, but it's a way inspired by thinking on a neurodiversity paradigm that I think gets us a little further. Okay. So what I want to do is draw a distinction between agents and the environmental conditions in which agents act. So lots of things might count as part of the environment on this distinction I want to make. So let's say maybe there's one door to a room and the person can't leave the room without pushing past other people who are in the doorway. So that's part of the agent's environment, not part of their agency. But no, it does constrain which actions are available for the agent. So it has some effect on sort of the terrain that person has to navigate with their agency. Okay, but there are also some mental features of agents that I want to suggest might also count as part of these environmental background conditions that an agent has to navigate. So let's first talk about some common examples. Imagine sort of extreme exhaustion or the urge to scratch an itch. So these, I think, are not things that reveal deep truths about a person, though she may manage these things indirectly, right? She could make sure she gets lots of sleep, and that might change it so she's not exhausted, or she might put aloe on her itchy skin. That will make it so she doesn't have an urge to scratch an itch. Those things might reveal to us something about her as an agent, but the bare fact that she's exhausted doesn't itself tell us something about her. So using the neurodiversity model as our guide now, I want to suggest that the boundary between environment and agent just differs a little bit in each person. There's just natural variance here that I think on its own is neither good nor bad. So I want to say a person who has coprolalia from Tourette syndrome just happens to have a piece of their psychology that stands outside of their agency that not all that many people have. So the urge to utter obscene language. And this, I think we should think of just like extreme exhaustion or the urge to scratch an itch. It's not something that reveals something especially deep about the person. If it causes them to act, we might think about it like how an urge to scratch an itch causes someone to scratch that itch. It's not something deeply agential, although perhaps it might be managed in some sorts of ways that might be agential. Okay, I know this is a little bit obscure without going into the details of what distinguishes a person's agency from their environment, and I do have an account of that, but I won't be able to go into too many details since what I really want to do is aim to give you a bigger picture sense of why this is important. Okay, but to return to this question, which actions are people in principle appraisable for? In short, I want to say the agential ones. So not ones that are mere byproducts of their environments, like falling asleep from exhaustion or scratching an itch. So just to give you a little bit more meat on the bones of this idea, the basic idea, I think, is that the agential ones are going to be at least loosely connected to the agent's deeper preferences and priorities, and thus reveal or express something about them. Okay, but here's the crucial part for our purposes. I think we can, however, be responsible for managing and navigating our environments or failing to do so. So take a nice example case here where you walk into a room and there's just a slur written on a whiteboard. Now, you didn't write it, but you know it will look like you did when someone who that slur targets walks into the room next. So perhaps you ought to erase it. Perhaps you would be responsible for failing to do so. It's not the same as if you had actually written it, but perhaps you might be responsible for this different thing, managing your environment. So likewise, I think it's at least possible that a person with Tourette syndrome could be responsible for insulting someone due to not temporarily suppressing an urge to say a slur. But I want to say two giant caveats to that. One, that's a very different thing than being responsible for saying a slur, full stop. And two, here's a big disanalogy. It's not cost-free to suppress an urge. It's quite painful. It's also not cost-free to cancel the implication by explaining that you have Tourette syndrome either, at least not in our current society. Okay, so right in the whiteboard case, it's probably not that hard to just erase the thing that's written on the whiteboard. Not so in our Tourette syndrome case. So I think there's a real question: who takes on these costs? Right? It's difficult to suppress these urges. It's difficult to explain to people, oh, it's going to seem like I'm saying a slur and I'm saying this horrible thing, but really it's because I have Tourette syndrome and this is what Tourette syndrome means. And it's just not obvious that we should make people with Tourette syndrome take on those burdens, right? So if we were operating on a differences defect model, we might think, well, we should pity that person, but it's kind of on them to explain and to take care of all of these costs, and we'll help if we can, but ultimately it's their problem, right? I don't think we should think like that. I think we actually have to think about questions of social justice. And importantly, I think we really can't do the ethics of blame without first answering some more basic questions of social justice that set the norms on which our moral responsibility system runs. So I think there's a two-step process that we can do, I think, by the way, with any kind of agential difference that will help bring the political nature of our norms of blame into the foreground. So the first sort of imaginative task is imagine everyone in the world had Tourette syndrome. What would the responsibility norms that they would design look like? Would they assume that all uttering of obscenity was directed at each other to be hateful? Probably not, right? They would just probably accept it as a normal part of life. They would operate on a norm, I would imagine, that you need further evidence that a person really meant to be hateful in saying something than just the fact that it was uttered. Okay, well, that's interesting, right? Now that means it's the fact that having Tourette syndrome is somewhat of a minority status that makes it the fact that there's even a problem here in this case at all. If that's right, it's certainly not obvious that we don't need to sort of share the burdens. So the next question that I think we should be asking is, if we don't assume any one particular way that the boundaries between agent and environment might be situated, we don't assume any one particular neurological setup that people would have, then what norms would we come up with for this situation? And it's not obvious. I think these are difficult questions. But I think one general lesson that we might draw from asking these questions is to say something like this: until it's truly costless, or at least much closer to costless, to disclose agential differences, we should be a lot more cautious than we usually are in our attributions and our judgments and our blame. I think there's probably something like we need to both work towards destigmatizing agential differences so that we can be a bit more nuanced in understanding how to read the social implications of what people are doing, while at the same time realizing that we're not there yet, doing some non-ideal theory, and realizing, look, it's not costless to disclose agential differences. Some people who have certain kinds of agential differences aren't even going to be aware of those. We have to look at access issues in terms of mental health. We have to look at all of these costs that we have in our current system. And we have to take those on board. And I think in general, we're going to find that we're going to want to relax some of our initial gut judgments that we have about people, since we tend to have in mind this sort of one ideal agent picture, right? And we think that we can sort of go through life as though we know how to read the social meanings of people's actions, and when perhaps we don't. Okay, so whether you're with me on the specifics of this Tourette syndrome case or not, my bigger point here is that these sort of interesting and important questions about burdens and the social justice issues and who takes on the costs and How do we make it more stigma-free to disclose agential differences? And how do we interact given those imperfections? All of those interesting and important questions, I think, are just obscured by the current dialectic. There's just not room to raise them because remember, the current dialectic just really gives us these two options. We say, aha, we have this person who said a slur, but it's from Tourette syndrome. Either the person is completely out of control and not responsible, or they're fully responsible, just like anyone else who said a slur. And I think that there's really interesting terrain and interesting questions that we need to pose and that we need to work on that are just really hard to see when we're operating on this current paradigm. I think part of the problem is that the way the moral responsibility literature has proceeded, this is a tiny bit of perhaps a genealogy of the moral responsibility literature, is that it has talked about people with agential differences and neurodivergences and psychological disability, but it usually talks about these people as examples of people who lack some sort of capacity. And people take, some capacity that they want to claim as fundamental to even being a responsible agent. And they'll look at this group of people and they say, surely we shouldn't blame them. It must be because they're not responsible agents, because they lack this fundamental capacity. And that's sort of the way this literature has developed. And it just makes it very hard to see what the ethics of interacting with people who have neurological differences, what those ethics are. Since we've sort of written people who don't fit this model of the ideal responsible agent out of the conversation in some sort of important way. So I think there are plenty of questions to be worked out still about what a new and better system would look like. But I think those are the discussions that I would really love to be having. I think that the need for a shift to a neurodiversity paradigm in this literature is very real. And hopefully it'll open up a richer set of questions about how we ought to interact with each other across spectrums of difference. Okay, I think I'll end there for now and take Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much, August. That was very inspiring. So I'm going to just go ahead and start with the first question. The first question is from Benjamin Carpenter. And the question is, how would your account respond to accounts of personhood that reject a substantive account of identity, the self? Trends within post-structuralist theory may argue against any fixed distinction between self and environment, and it seems your account of agency relies upon an ability to very precisely distinguish between parts of the psychology within and without an agent's control. I'm wondering if the notion of control often used within this literature might be more centrally the problem. Would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Great. Thanks so much. That's an excellent question. So I think there's two things. I do want to advance some claims about this substantive distinction between self and environment, but I do think that's in principle separable from the larger critique that I want to make. And perhaps you're right here, that it's this notion of control, or at least a simplistic way of thinking, right, about agential difference and sort of having that amount to someone's being out of control of themselves. That's really where the neurodiversity-based critique is centered, right? I think that I want to sketch what it might look like to have a neurodiversity-inspired paradigm to talk about it. But, right, you might critique that for other reasons. And I do think that there's something interesting to say about the idea that there's this fixed boundary between self and environment, because I'm not sure that I even want to claim that. I might not go so far as being in a post-structuralist theory in terms of the flexibility between self and environment. But even without going that far, I think that sometimes people are able to modify the boundary between self and environment. And I was asked a really interesting question once about people who want to like reclaim part of their ticking behavior as something. So there's people who use their tics as part of artistic expression, for example, right? Could you take this thing that I'm claiming as part of the environment and somehow incorporate it into part of yourself? I think that there's some room to think about this as, oh, I'm sorry, timer, as a flexible boundary, more so than it might have appeared in my rough sketch. So anyway, just to summarize, two quick things. One is that, yes, I think that you can take on board my sort of neurodiversity critique without accepting all of the details of my self-environment picture. And two, I'm open to thinking about the self-environment picture being a little more flexible than what it might have appeared like. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Our next question, Leslie Klein asks, she first thanks you for the great talk, and then asks, there's also the point of view of the person affected by the slur. Isn't it true that it is still a slur and may have to be dealt with, but taking into account the agential differences in the person making the slur, for example, race hatred legislation?
Absolutely. And I realize now that in my presentation, I didn't especially make that clear, but I actually think that's part of why this is such an interesting and important question, and why I've used this particular case to illustrate, because I think the issues here are really thorny. It's absolutely right? We can't discount the perspective of a person who's just heard a slur. I think we need to think about, in order to really answer the ethics of blame in the particular case, we'd need to know more details, about these people's identity. Does it matter if the person with Tourette syndrome is part of the relevant minority group? Does it matter if that person is part of the oppressive class that's oppressing people of that particular group? And those questions are different, from just the ethics of slurs in general. What about the ethics of managing sort of accidentally saying slurs in this way that I don't know, I don't ultimately know how we settle those questions, but I think in order to have a productive conversation that incorporates the interests of these groups, these different groups that have to be taken into account, we have to get clear about what sort of question we're asking in terms of a person with Tourette syndrome or some other kind of agential difference. And we have to get clear about the fact that we're asking a different question than just the question of, what are the ethics of slurs in this situation? And so ultimately, at the end of the day, there might be different sorts of situations where, ultimately it does make sense to say, look, this is the kind of case where you need to be able to manage saying this. I need to, if it's me, I need to recognize that this is like an extremely hateful word, and it's really unfortunate. And that even when I have the best of intentions, some people might not understand, and there are real costs to that in the world. But we need to be able to do sort of the social justice philosophy so that it doesn't automatically become the responsibility of the person, I think, who has the agential difference to take on all of that themselves. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is from Cynthia Stark, and she also thanks you for this very interesting talk. And she asks, can you explain why in the case where the person with Tourette's is not held responsible for the not held responsible, the associated feeling is pity. It seems that we could hold persons not responsible, but not pity them. Does this idea come about of a Strassonian account of blame?
Great question. I think that's right. So I may have been giving a bit of a caricature in a way, and you're right to press me on this. A caricature of the idea that if someone is exempt from blame, we have to pity them, right? It seems to imply that sort of picture of the world to me, and I think that's why I'm saying it seems like I guess we have to just pity them. But you're right, you don't strictly, you could have a view that such people are just completely exempt. It's due to the fact that they lack some important capacity, but not think that you have to pity them. I do think on the question about does it come out of a Strassonian account of blame, I do think that there is something problematic about the way people often talk about taking the objective attitude on a Strassonian account of blame. So the idea is meant to be something like, we can't have a full-fledged kind of relationship with a person who doesn't have this sort of capacity. We take the objective attitude and we're really just sort of treating them almost like an animal. And these sorts of words are used. And I guess to me that implies that this kind of just treating someone by managing them or almost treating them like an animal or a small child sort of implies this feeling of we have to pity them. But perhaps you could have a very different attitude, right? Even Strawson says, right, you might take on that objective attitude if you're a therapist, for example, and therapists aren't pitying their clients, they're trying to work with them to shape them in certain ways. And one might also take a sort of objective attitude towards some part of themselves without having pity. So there might be room to work within a Strassonian tradition and change those attitudes into something more productive. And but I myself am not inclined to go that way because I think and I haven't fully articulated this, but there's something about it to me that just seems somewhat conceptually tied to a pathology model. And I might be wrong about that. But there seems an awfully close connection. Perhaps it's because there's a sort of disengagement with the person as an agent in some sense, which I find troubling. But this is an excellent question that I think I want to think more about. So thank you.
Great. Thank you as well. And then Claire asks, just wondering if you make a distinction between intention and harm in considering blame. So with my ND son, we've always talked about how explanations for an action, i.e. I didn't know saying that would hurt your feelings, matter for intention and thus impact blame. But when it comes to the harm, the reasons don't mean that the person's feelings are no longer hurt.
Nice. Yeah, I think this is a good sort of common sense way of drawing out a distinction that I think is important. So it's perhaps a way that we have in sort of common parlance of talking about the sort of distinction I might be after when I'm saying something like, it's just very different, someone who wants to say a slur just in order to be hateful versus the person who wants to say a slur because they have this buildup of energy that's giving them an urge to discharge this tick. Otherwise, they'll go through a lot of psychological distress otherwise. And that's right, I think. That's two very different kinds of intent. And what's nice about this sort of common sense way of talking about it is you can say, look, even though there's different kinds of intent, there's still a harm that's present. That said, I wouldn't want to subscribe to the view that sort of no matter the intent, the harm is the only thing that matters, because the harm isn't sort of inevitable, right? Because we could have built a world in which it's very easy for people who have Tourette syndrome to be open enough about this that there wouldn't just be these situations where someone's stuck in a room and the other person has never heard of Tourette syndrome and they're just always going to be harmed. And so I don't want to go so far as to say, look, it's just your personal responsibility for whatever harm ends up happening, because I think in some important sense, it's all of our responsibility to manage that harm. One thing that I do like about this picture, where I'm talking about self and environment, is that we all might have some responsibility to manage environments. And that's clear once we sort of take it out of that person's agency in a way. The situation is a situation that's a relationship between self and environment, but other people can interact with the environment and other people can shape the way that social messages are received. So there's things I really like about that distinction, but there's also, I think, some more nuance that I would want to add into it. Thanks.
Great. And then we have a follow-up by Javier Camargo. They ask, in this topic of responsibility, it is interesting the responsibility that is deposited on the parents who have a neurodivergent child. The tendency in society is that parents control their children. What do you think from your perspective? And thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Thanks. So this is really interesting. So I am interested in this topic, I think I should say, sort of from two perspectives at the same time. One is just from being involved in the moral responsibility literature and noticing some sort of implicit differences, defect thinking, and wanting to excavate that. But another perspective is just being a person who navigates this world. So I have ADHD, I have a partner who's autistic, and we often have the sorts of interactions where we have to navigate these very issues, right? We have to decide how to distribute the burdens of how we can interpret and misinterpret each other. And they're very real world questions. And these are, real ethical interpersonal issues that I think are really quite common, actually, because I really do think that we all have sorts of different ways of navigating this world. And so the question of parents who then have some sort of children who are neurologically different from them is an interesting one, because it's right in my relationship with my partner, we're sort of on even footing in a way, right? And so we try to balance things as evenly as we can. Like, okay, I'll take on the burden of remembering that you don't mean it when you say this thing. This is just a thing that happens. And okay, I'll realize that you're just irritable when you have this sort of sensory thing going on, but it's not really directed at me, right? We can sort of do that in an even way. Now, when you're a parent, though, I think you take on some additional responsibilities. I think that there's an interesting duality that all people who are some sort of neurodivergent minority have to cope with, I think, which is trying to understand themselves and being able to even parse what their own intent is versus what it might seem like their intent was. And also navigating what intent their actions will seem to have given the paradigms and the norms that our society has. And as a parent, I would imagine, and I'm not a parent myself yet, that there's a difficult and important balancing act between explaining to children who might be neurodivergent the ways that their actions will likely be interpreted in this world, and also sort of working towards a more just world where people might be able to understand different social meanings for actions. And so it's a really tough job, but parenting is a really tough job. So I think that's my answer there. Thanks.
Great. And if I could actually ask a follow-up. So it seems to be the case that others, right? This relationship between others and self is really, really important in determining responsibility. And would you say also in determining like agential responsibility, right? So it's like when we think about, well, what is the agent actually responsible for? It seems that that input from the society, not just that they're part of the environment, but the interaction, right? So what others are responsible for seems to also define what one is responsible for, which I don't think people really talk about, especially in individualistic kind of centered ethics.
Yes, I think that's a great point. I'm really glad you said that. So I have another piece. I think it's going to end up being a piece of the book where I'm looking at the impacts of trauma on agency. And this is a case where I think it really makes clear, right? If we ask questions like, well, what would society look like if we had adequate resources for trauma survivors? And then when we want to ask these questions about, this person had a really traumatic past, right? Should we hold them responsible for what they did anyway, even though they had a traumatic past? That I think is a nice example of what you're saying, where it's like, well, what about our obligations as a society to like give people the resources to handle trauma? And here's a case where, in terms of who's responsible and where the boundaries of that agent are, get very murky once we sort of bring in that social dimension. So thanks, it's a great question.
Thank you. And then we also have Jenny Clark Schiff, who asked, first she says, thank you for your insightful presentation. And then she asks, could you clarify how one goes about determining in what context certain features of a person are to be counted as something in the agential sphere, so to speak, and when they are not? For example, while exhaustion in the case you use may be something that can be tended to, in other contexts, exhaustion can be a key component of someone's disability. Consider chronic fatigue syndrome or ME/CFS.
Awesome. This is a great question. So I do have a lot more to say that I won't be able to say entirely right now about how you determine the difference between agent and environment. I have like a pretty complex view about this, and I hinted just slightly that I think in order for something to count as agential, it's going to have to be linked in some way with a person's preferences and priorities. I actually think the connection doesn't have to be quite as strong as some people think. I don't think you have to like reflect on your desires and choose one and act on it in the Harry Frankfurt picture. I think the process can really be much less explicit and intentional. And I have a particular way that I like to carve that distinction. That said, I think that I truly believe that people are really quite individual on a lot of these metrics. So if we even just go back to my kind of goofy picture here with the two different agents, I think the shape of agency really is going to look a little bit different in each person. And so even things like exhaustion, people are going to have very different relationships with. And so So I think that's exactly right. Since this is different in different people, we're going to want to say different things about different cases. And I wish I had more to say about exhaustion in particular and chronic fatigue, and I don't at this moment, but that's something I should really investigate more. I think that's an interesting case, right, where managing exhaustion is going to become a really prominent feature of someone's life. And then we want to think, right, about how we would more equitably distribute those costs and how that would impact blame. And one of the reasons that I used exhaustion as an example is I've just noticed in my own life that there are differences in the ways that people experience exhaustion and even falling asleep. So for some people, I think it's more agential, like, okay, I'm choosing to go to sleep now. And if I don't choose that, I could stay up for quite a long time. And for other people, you really might just fall asleep. And so depending on what sort of agential relationship you have, even to something like exhaustion, I think can make a big difference in whether or not, if someone falls asleep during what you're saying, you could take that as a sign of disrespect or not. And so we really do need to be careful, even about easy or obvious seeming examples, that we're really taking into account the diversity of ranges of being an agent and interacting with these sorts of experiences. So thank you. Great question.
Very nice. Thank you very much. I'm thinking we're out of time currently. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, August. I think you gave us a lot to think about. And the audience, please stay tuned for the next presentation and have a good day.
And can I thank you, Cecilia, as well as August, a really fantastic session. And we can see we've got a huge number of questions still in the Q&A and in the chat that we didn't get to. We could have spent so long on this. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of all of the audience and the organizers. So really fabulous. Thanks so much.